Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. We're restoring confidence in science, faith, and family. Our lack of faith in God, in trusted institutions, and in science has led to a societal upheaval and allowed radical ideologies to flourish. The redefinition of marriage, the belittlement of men and fathers, the children we neglect to raise are all very costly alternatives. So when I told my wife that I was speaking today to be a moderator, she said, you know, a lot of those people know you and they're all going to be thinking the same thing. There's so many smart people there today, why are you up there? And I said, I'm pretty smart. And she said, the people on the panel have written more books than you have read. I said, well, then I guess it's because I'm the eye candy today. And she said, do you have a mirror at home any longer? So I'm trying to think about why am I here, and the only thing that came to mind is that I am a father. And I have 2 children. And there was a study by a Swiss group a long time ago, or 20 years ago or so, that said when fathers do not go to church on a regular basis, only 2% of their children will attend regularly. My children go to church because I went to church, and I call out fathers everywhere saying, you need to go to church. The third most attended church day among Catholics is Mother's Day, after Christmas and Easter. Of the 52 weeks of the Catholic calendar, the third least day attending church is Father's Day. We as fathers need to step up, and some of the things that the panel is going to discuss today will bring that to light. But I call on all the fathers to really step up. My daughters go to church, and my grandchildren go to church, and we all need to be leaders out there, and we need to bring faith back to our communities, and we need to do it by our own leadership. One of the other things that's out there that we learned is that on July 4th, we celebrated the Declaration of Independence, but I look at it a little differently, that it's the Declaration of Dependence. It's dependence on God. When they wrote it, they talked about we are endowed by our creators. We need to be a godly nation because that's what has made us great. And so think about it every time that we are a dependent nation, dependent on God because we are endowed by our creator. So I want to talk about our panelists here. We'll have a lot more important stuff to say than I do. So with us today is Mary Hasson. She'll be leading off. She is the Kate O'Byrne Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Mrs. Hasson directs the Catholic Women's Forum and is co-founder of the Person and Identity Project that helps equip parents to promote truth in the human person. Mrs. Hasson has co-authored several books on education and is frequently called upon to provide expert counsel on federal and state legislations. So I very much will turn the microphone over to Mary, and thank you.
Press 2, right? All right. Yeah. Terrific. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here because I think of all the differences among us, I think more of what unites us, and that is our faith, our desire to serve each other, to serve this country, and to come together today to figure out some ways to make things better. So I want to start giving a bit of an overview of some of the high points that you're going to hear from the other panelists, but also digging a little bit deeper into some of the themes that you've heard from some of the speakers already. And one of those being that we all know that faith is on the decline in this country. But what does that mean? What's the significance of that? I think it's important to remember what role faith perhaps has played in our own lives. My father is an Irish immigrant, and he lived in Queens. And in Queens, you had the Irish Catholic Church, and a couple of blocks away, you had the Italian Catholic Church, and a couple of blocks away, you had another ethnic group, that was part of the church as well. But the church was part of the community. It was the center of their lives. So, for example, the entertainment on the weekends was always at the church. In fact, my father boxed. So as an 8th grader, one of the entertainments that the parish did was to have smokers, where people would come and they would watch 8th graders box each other. Now, we think of that and we say, kids boxing each other. But it was part of what they did. They all came together and it was the center of their lives. That's not even possible today. In the neighborhood where I live, the center of people's lives is the public school. It's the place where people go for their weekend activities. It's the place where they connect with others. The church has been erased from that place in our lives. So this decline in religiosity is not just about whether you're going to church or not. It's a degradation of our sense of identity and our sense of community. And it's particularly troublesome for the young. Because whereas when my parents were growing up, if they were in a group of people, 9 out of 10 people would be religious believers. For our young people, for my own children, when they are in a group of people, more than likely, half of the people are going to be atheist, agnostic, or none. Because in Generation Z, that's what the totals are. Over 40% of our young people identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing at all. So it affects, for our young people, their sense of friendship. Who can they be friends with? Who can they count on? Not just to change the tire, but to support them and help them to do the right thing. Those people are missing from their lives because they don't have that faith community. It's projected that this number of nuns is going to grow and, in fact, will dominate the American scene within our children's lifetimes. In other words, the decline of religion is real, but again, it's remaking our society because people no longer have that strong sense of who I am. Why? Because ultimately, that understanding of our identity has to be rooted in the recognition that we are created by a God who loves us and who put us here for a purpose. That grounds everything. It gives us our dignity. When we no longer have that, you have what we see today, which is young people who are lonely, who are searching, struggling to figure out who they are, questioning everything because they have no givens in their life. The givens that come from faith, that come from being part of a community that believes in something deep. So without meaning, without that sense of belonging, our children open themselves up to believing, as Dennis Prager said, anything. And so what we have today, and you're going to hear more about this from Jay, is we have a clash of anthropologies within our culture. Two competing visions of who we are, and they're irreconcilable. We are either human beings with dignity, every human being with dignity, given by God, created male and female with a purpose, as Ryan talked about. Or we're self-defining and we can be whoever we want to be. And that's the big lie that so many of our young people have fallen for. Not knowing God, not even having been exposed to religion. They don't think of religion as a good thing. When they're searching for identity, it doesn't occur to them that that answer can be found in God and in faith and understanding God's plan for their lives. But it devolves even further. When you don't have God, when the only authority in your life is you make up the rules. And so one of the things we see is the ascendance of what's called queer theory, which is deliberate and intentional in its aim to destroy our understanding of the human person, to destroy marriage, to destroy family, to destroy morality, that all of these things are oppressive to the person who says, I'll write my own rules. I'm in charge of me. My body, my choice, writ large. So queer theory is pervading everything. And we can see this in just simple statistics. One of the changes in our landscape, different from even when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, is just the degradation of morality. So as people who have a biblical morality, when we look at what Gallup tells us about what Americans think, we see that almost every major biblical position is disregarded by the majority of American people. In other words, they may profess to be believing Jews or believing Christians, but in fact, the authority in their life is no longer God and His rules for their lives. It's whatever they decide. So this change, this I'll write my own rules, means that things don't work out that well. And so we see, even as people will insist that they don't believe in the God-given rules and they get to write their own, they know something's wrong. So again, we look at these polls and they say most Americans, at least most people who are conservative and Republican and have some sort of faith, will say things are drastically wrong in terms of morality. Even in a more general sense, putting aside sexual morality, but just whether or not we can be good to each other. We recognize there's a problem. Part of this is because we are not forming families. Our children are not growing up, not only not in a religious community, they're not oftentimes growing up in any community at all. If you don't grow up in a community, you don't learn to give of yourself. You don't learn to sacrifice. In fact, our kids have always been very involved in sports. And you see a lot of kids who know how to sacrifice. They'll put in long hours in the pool or on the track, but they're sacrificing for themselves. What I don't often see is the same ability to forego something they want for the sake of someone else. And yet we all know that that's what love requires. So we have an impoverished generation that sociologists will tell us it's the most connected generation, but the loneliest. The ones with the most deficient relationships, lacking people to love, or even a sense of how to love. So I want to spend my last couple of minutes just focusing in on one particular aspect that hasn't come up very much so far today, and that's the question of parental rights. Because when you reject God as the authority in your life, when you reject family as a source of authority, you get what we're seeing increasingly in our culture today, which is that the state is intruding and becoming the authority in our children's lives, oftentimes under the guise of saying our children need to be empowered to be autonomous beings and make their own decisions. Many parents believe, because they get notes from their school requiring them to sign a permission slip before their child gets Tylenol, many of them believe, I really have authority over deciding what's good for my child, and yet it's not the case. In reality, parental rights, parental authority to decide what is good and help our children choose what is good is being gutted in the law, in the culture, and even, unfortunately, in parents' own mindsets. There's an undue deference to what the experts will say, instead of relying on your own sense of knowing what's good for your children. So we have specific exceptions that are in the law, but these have become so elastic. The whole idea of sensitive issues. Adolescent medicine specialists will now look at an adolescent coming in and they'll want the parent out of the room because they view this child as someone they need to influence, and that child needs to make their own decisions apart from whatever their parents believe. So these sensitive issues and the rights of the state, or the right of the state to disregard parents, always has come about in times of crisis. And I think one good thing about the COVID crisis is it's helped us realize that in times of crisis, the state is going to move in and push legitimate authority out of the way and take that authority. But this has been going on for decades. From the time of the 60s, the sexual revolution, and people worried about kids getting STIs, the crisis was, you can't tell parents that these kids need an STI test or they won't get tested. Well, guess what? We've been doing that now for 40 years, and the STI rate is through the roof. Kids need their parents in the same way with pregnancy and contraception and abortion. And now we're seeing it with HIV tests and HIV medicine. We're seeing it with gender dysphoria, with mental health issues. In all these things, doctors feel free very often, depending on the state law, but feel free to disregard parents' role in their children's lives. This is just a quick snapshot from the CDC. You can go on either Guttmacher or CDC and look at the ages at which children are allowed to consent for their own STI testing, HIV testing. Imagine a 12-year-old girl who tests positive for an STI. There's something wrong in that girl's life. She needs her parents to protect her, but the doctors don't have to tell the parents because there's this exception written into almost every state law. So medicine, we see the same thing in education. This just came out this past week. Some Republican legislators have put forward a bill to prevent federal funding of any programs that include explicit sexuality and are aimed at children under 10. Last I checked, there were only 33 Republicans who had signed on to that, and no Democrats. It's a great bill. I don't think it's going to pass. Where have we gotten to as a culture that we as a society can't gather around that idea that children and their innocence needs to be protected? That's how far we've come. So there will be more good news from others on the panel. I'm not usually the good news lady, but just realize that the cultural moment we're in now is like a riptide. And so it's pulling our kids away from what is true, what is good. So we have to know that. We have to recognize that cultural riptide, because it's going to take firm commitments on our part in order to protect them and to turn things around. And we'll talk more about that a little later, but with this, I'll let Jay give you a little bit more bad news.
And obviously, I'm not the Jay that knows anything about it. So who we have next is Jay Richards, Dr. Jay Richards, who's the director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family, and the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in Religious Liberty and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. He researches, writes, and speaks on the policy that protects life, marriage, religious liberty, and civil society. Dr. Richards previously served as a research assistant professor in the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. It's an honor to have you here, Jay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jay. Appreciate it. It's a delight to be with you, and this is a wonderful conference. And I have to say, both at breakfast and lunch, I've eaten from the kosher table, and both times somebody said, "Oh no, your food's over there." But I've got dietary restrictions. It turns out kosher works really well. So that's one of the wonderful things about this conference, and just an amazing mix of people here in the middle of the week. And so it's a delight for all of us speaking to be here. So my task is, as Mary said, to give you some of the depressing news, but this is stuff you mostly know at a certain level. And so what I really want to do is I want to help you in the next few minutes understand down to the bones exactly what gender ideology is. I am absolutely convinced, I'm not a natural optimist. I am absolutely convinced that 10 years from now, what's happening with gender ideology in the culture, and in particular in the schools and medicine, is going to be quite different. If it ends in no other way, it will end with 100,000 detransitioners in a class action lawsuit suing to oblivion these gender clinics that are operating on kids. So honestly, But for me, that's worst case scenario. It would really be nice not to have 100,000 or some odd kids as collateral damage in order to stop this. I think our main impediment at the moment to stopping this is that it is so deranged and so bizarre that most people, when you first tell them about it, get that look on your face like, oh no, this is the fluoride in the water guy cornering me again. How do I get out of here, right? It's like you get the crazy eyes when you start talking about this because it's so crazy, and so people are generally inclined not to believe it's this bad, or they think, okay, maybe something like this happened in one school in Berkeley, California, and it got put on Twitter. It's really not a big deal. That is wrong. It is absolutely everywhere. 2 days ago in Stillwater, Oklahoma, was a radical school-sponsored drag queen story hour for kids. All right, so it's a radical sexualization of small kids, bizarre parodying of the feminine form in Stillwater, Oklahoma, which I'm pretty sure is probably one of the most conservative places in the country. This is absolutely everywhere, and there is a reason that they're coming for our children. And they are absolutely doing this. This is 3 of many books I could show you, all published, written, designed, given awards and feted and then adopted for kindergarten classrooms. And so kindergarten books are books that are written for a teacher to read along with his or her kids because, of course, most kindergartners can't read well. And so these are the kinds of books they are. These are all books designed to teach gender ideology to children who would otherwise find it counterintuitive. By the time kids are 5 or 6, one of the most clear and stable categories they have, if they have just kind of been exposed to reality and not distorted intentionally, is that there are boys and girls, there are adults and children. And so if you want to persuade people that no, the category of boys and girls is passé, you've got to get them when they're young. Okay, and so these are books that are already in libraries. So what that would tell you, if you know anything about publishing, it took 5 or 10 years in the pipeline for these things to find their way to adoption in public schools. Now, what do these teach? So let me just give you one example from It Feels Good to Be Me. The principal lesson, easy to remember, some people are boys, some people are girls, some people are both, neither, or somewhere in between. Right? That's a nice distillation of gender ideology. And the implication of that, if you think about it, because people tend to have boy or girl bodies. And so what if think you're in between, but you have a boy body? That would mean you're born in the wrong body. Right? And so this actually boils down to this question. Should we teach children that they might be born in the wrong body? So that if they're discontent with their bodies, the proper treatment is to transform the bodies with pill and scalpel, rather than adjusting their self-perception. It actually boils down to that. And I can think of no more toxic idea, but this is precisely what we are either implicitly or explicitly teaching our children in virtually every school district in the country. So what is gender ideology? How could we get to a position where the American Academy of Pediatrics, to name just one of many groups like this, could actually claim that proper gender-affirming care requires transforming a teenage girl's body to conform to her misimpression of her identity. How could that happen? It could only happen by complete ideological capture of a very, very bizarre idea. And this is the basic idea. You can analyze it in terms of concepts, or you can analyze it in terms of words. So in English, unfortunately, we have 2 rough synonyms that were often used interchangeably. And for a long time, at least when I was growing up, the word we used when we were talking about biology, whether one is male or female, was the word sex. So you'd see that on doctors' forums, you'd see it on applications for passports, what's your sex, right? There are always 2 choices, M or F, simple enough. The problem is the word sex in English also refers to the sex act, right? It's the same word. But that's actually a different thing. And so in certain contexts, saying sex can be sort of embarrassing to people. And so there has been actually for centuries, I've traced this back at least to the 16th century, the use of the word gender to refer to sex in the biological sense, and gender is associated with biological reproduction as well. It's genus, genealogy, all those kinds of words. So think of those as sort of synonyms. But what happened is, certainly in my lifetime, is that the word sex, when talking about male and female, about the sexual binary, mostly dropped out of usage and was replaced almost entirely by this rough, fuzzy synonym, gender. Now, if that's the only part of the story, this would not have been significant. But another thing happened behind the scenes. Think of it as the sort of city stays in the same place on the surface of the earth, but the tectonic plates got replaced underneath. The kind of fundamental conceptual tectonic plates of how we think of these things was transformed in the academy, so that when the word gender at some point was being used, it was not really being used to refer to this biological thing, but to this internal, subjective, psychological thing called a gender identity, which is a fundamentally different thing. Okay, now, what is that exactly? So gender ideology is the replacement of sex as a biological reality that we observe with a purely subjective concept of gender identity. Now, I can prove this to you with two images designed, again, to teach children how to think in these terms. And so kids, as I said, as all of us know, will naturally come to the impression somehow they develop this prejudice that there are boys and girls in the world, right? If left to their own devices, they sort of come to this conclusion. And so you want to teach kids, don't think of people as simple boys and girls. Think of them as having these different aspects of themselves that we will refer to broadly as gender. So rather than boy and girl, we're going to look at the genderbread person. Okay, so you get the gag, right? So the genderbread person, it's not a boy or a girl. The genderbread person has an identity, which in this image is identified with the brain. Attraction, so your orientation or your romantic attraction identified sort of with the symbolic heart. Your expressions, so the way you express yourself, the way you dress, whether you wear makeup, if you have an up tilt, if you have vocal fry, which is what all Gen Zers have, incidentally. So that's your expression. And then you have a thing called biological sex. And if you weren't paying attention, you might think this is what gender ideology teaches, that there's an internal gender that's different from biological sex. And so if you think that, I want you to know that the guy that developed the genderbread person was eviscerated by committed gender ideologues for getting it wrong, for not fully understanding the philosophy. And in fact, notice this is the genderbread person version 3.3. So he kept trying, right? But still stuck here. So what's problematic about this? Not from our perspective, but from the gender ideologues' perspective. It's right here, biological sex. Right, so the category itself has to go. There are also a couple of other bad things. Notice here, identity is identified with a brain. A brain's a physical, biological object, so it's presumably could be studied, so that's a problem. And then also, I'm surprised no one walked out when you realize the genderbread person looks like a boy, right? We don't like that, and so eventually he updated this, but before he did, a better version that you saw came to displace it. And the gender unicorn is the sort of apotheosis of gender ideology. So if you get what's happening here and you get the change, get the delta between genderbread person version 3.3 and the gender unicorn, you will get what's going on. So what do you notice about the genderbread person? First of all, there's a fetishization of childhood and a fantasy. We're dealing with a purple unicorn here. It's androgynous, right? You can't tell if it's a boy or girl. Also needs to work out more, but that's a different point. The brain is gone, right? So now we have a thought bubble. Of course, it's of a rainbow, but entirely ethereal and immaterial. It's not even tethered to a brain. And then here's the key point. Biological sex is gone. It's replaced with sex assigned at birth. All right, so the person, the human being, insofar as there's a human being, is independent of his or her body. So your body has no intrinsic meaning with respect to who you are or to your identity. You're, as Carl Truban puts it, this mere psychological self, this disembodied kind of subjective entity. Right? And then, so that's a purely psychological category. And then, insofar as we thought we had a thing called biological sex, that's just a social construction imposed upon us by doctors who have learned the kind of old, outdated theory. But there is, in any case, Nothing about biological sex. Now, this has not only happened in classrooms, this is happening in federal legislation, in almost every regulatory bill. This is the depressing kind of stuff that Mary and I do in our day jobs, is read regulations. The federal regulations are disappearing the word female and the word woman and the word pregnant or lactating woman, replacing it with lactating individual, right? This stuff is full steam ahead. This is the only way that it happens, is an ideology that replaces the human person as an individual created in the image of God, fully material and fully spiritual, not one or the other, right? Not ghost trapped in machines, not just mere upright apes, but both, the dust of the earth and the breath of God at one and the same time. Displaces our intrinsic sociality, which requires that to fulfill God's first commandment or blessing to be fruitful and multiply, we require someone of the opposite sex. And hence that relationship, that biological relationship, that we are incomplete biologically with this one function, requires exactly one male and female, which makes sense of the institution of marriage and childbearing. So all these things, the natural, the moral, the revelatory, they all hang together in this particular perception. All of it is shattered into pieces by gender ideology. This is the only way that the commanding heights of culture could become convinced of something so horrific as the idea that we should sterilize 16, 17, 18-year-old girls, remove their breasts, inject them with testosterone. That's the only way this could happen, is if lots and lots of very smart and influential people come to believe this. That's the beginning of that part of the bad news. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Miriam Grossman, who's going to complete the deal. Thank you very much.
So Miriam next. So next, as Jay alluded to, is Miriam Grossman. She is a child, an adolescent, and adult psychiatrist who has been exposing the falsehoods and dangers of radical sex and gender education for over a decade. She is the author of 4 books, among them Unprotected. A campus psychiatrist reveals how political correctness in their profession endangers every student. And You're Teaching My Child What? About sex and gender education. Dr. Grossman has lectured on 4 continents about these topics, including at the United Nations and at Britain's House of Lords. You may also recognize Dr. Grossman from her appearance in Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman? So here for us is Dr. Grossman. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My psychiatric practice consists of teens and young adults who are confused about their gender identity. I do not follow the official guidelines of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the Department of Health and Human Services. I do not accept my patient's new identity automatically, and nor do I automatically use their preferred names and pronouns, or refer them for medical interventions. Instead, I get to know them. We establish a trusting relationship, and then we slowly and carefully explore together why it is that they wish to become a different person. I see from up close the harm done by gender ideology. Kids convinced that they are living in the wrong bodies. Parents who, for the first time in their lives, need psychiatric medications in order to function. Marriages destroyed, families torn apart by the state. There are horrific things, nightmares, that you cannot imagine going on in this country right now because of the dangerous ideas that you just heard Jay explain. For example, I spoke last week to a father in Connecticut whose 14-year-old emotionally disturbed daughter was not permitted to be returned to his home because he refused to consider her a boy. The Child Protective Services stepped in, prevented her from being discharged into his care. The mother had left the family a long time ago. And they took this girl and placed her with a gay male couple. This man has not seen his daughter for 3 years. The state put her on testosterone against his will, but using his insurance to pay for it. I have also talked to parents who have paid the ultimate price. Their children took hormones, had surgery, and then committed suicide. We have been ambushed by a false ideology, and we are at war. It's important to say it. We are at war. And I might add, finally, we are at war because gender indoctrination has been baked into sex education for decades. And I wrote about it in my 2009 book called You're Teaching My Child What? The horse is out of the barn, and we are finally recognizing that we have a problem. Today, I bring to your attention that in fighting this war, we are not using some of the most powerful ammunition at our disposal, and that is hard science. You all know that hard science deals with the physical world, biology, chemistry, physics. It studies things that can be easily observed and measured in an objective way. Soft science studies things that are more difficult to observe and measure, like behavior and emotions. For example, anthropology and sociology are soft sciences. There is a new specialty in medicine, and I wonder if people here have even heard of it. It's called gender-specific medicine. It came to be because doctors realized that those chromosomes in every cell, you know, those little X's and those little Y's, they have an impact on every system in the body. Not just the reproductive system. I'm not just talking about sperm and eggs. Forget about that. These chromosomes, whether XX or XY, they have an impact on the cells of the heart, the brain, the liver, the immune system. They have an impact on conditions such as cancer, cardiac arrhythmia, lung disease, hypertension, autism, the list goes on and on. So I brought this book with me, Principles of Gender-Specific Medicine. And yes, I schlepped it on the plane because I wanted to show you that we have an arsenal of weapons that we can use against the false notion that there is no such thing as male or female. It's called gender-specific medicine because, oh, I already told you that. Okay, this is a 700-page book, and 95% of it is hard science. There is a huge difference between men and women when it comes to understanding disease, treating disease, and developing pharmaceuticals. Because cells with a double X sometimes respond to injury or disease or medications differently than cells with an XY. And that's important. We need to look at that. Now, of course, my young patients don't know about gender-specific medicine. They think that male and female is a social construct, that it's something that was randomly assigned to them at birth and then further imposed by their parents, schools, and society. They think it's repressive. They think it's about stereotypes and expectations about how to dress and behave. And they are certain that their being male or female has nothing at all to do with their biology. They believe these things with a religious zealotry. But their beliefs are not substantiated by any hard science whatsoever. Not only is gender ideology unsubstantiated by science, it is a mockery of science. It is a travesty of science. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you, but first I'm going to tell you a little story. An elderly rabbi was deep in his study of mysticism when he heard from outside his little grandson crying. He closed the book and he went out and asked him what happened. The boy said, "I was playing hide and seek with my friends, and I found a really good hiding place. They looked, and they couldn't find me. And then they gave up. They stopped looking. They went and did something else without me, and I was left alone." His grandfather hugged him and said, "This is a very important lesson that I want you to always remember. In this world, God plays hide and seek with us. Sometimes he finds a really good hiding place. It's so good that we want to give up looking. If we do that, God cries. Because like you, he doesn't want to be alone. In my life, God was hiding until I got to medical school, and I found him, believe it or not, in my textbook of female reproduction. I was studying for an exam on hormone synthesis and ovulation, conception, implantation, and it was all so complex. I had 3 books open in front of me, and there were diagrams and pathways and pictures of cells and the fallopian tubes and these tiny, tiny microscopic hairs in the fallopian tubes, and if they're not moving in the right direction to move the little egg along toward into the uterus, then the whole thing is messed up. We heard earlier from Dr. Lindsay about how the COVID vaccine injures the female reproductive system. That's because it is so delicate and complex. It's not like changing a tire. Anyway, I was in the midst of all this and I realized that this is so big and I am so small. This is infinite, but my brain is so finite. Everything here is shouting design, purpose, wonder. This is a symphony. This is 10 symphonies, thousands of instruments playing at once in perfect harmony. There's a composer here. So started my lifelong love affairs with female biology and also my path toward Judaism. And one of the early results of those love affairs was this book that I wrote in 1988. called The Wonder of Becoming You, and it's a book for girls explaining the wonders of puberty. It's extremely innocent. It explains what a 9 or 10-year-old girl needs to know, and not more. Given my fascination with this topic, I think you can understand why it troubles me so that kids are taught to separate male and female from biology, to alienate themselves from their physicality. They are told that being a woman is like putting on a costume. It's something you can buy from doctors and surgeons and drug companies. It's something you wear to change the way you think about yourself and how the world sees you. I have teenage boy patients who want so much to be on estrogen because they genuinely believe that they are girls and that estrogen will just bring their bodies in consonance with that. They will grow breasts, they will grow wider hips, their skin will be smoother. They may not get any periods, they may not get pregnant, but still, they'll still be a woman. They've been told this because they've been seeing that gingerbread and unicorn diagram since they're babies, practically. And they believe it. Trust me. But it's a deception. It's a terrible lie that they're going to pay for. All they can achieve is a synthetic identity, one that requires lifelong medications and causes serious medical complications, including a shortened lifespan. But perhaps even more important than that is that they can never truly achieve what they have been told they can achieve. And at some point, they will have to face that. Now, I want to give you just a taste of the real biology, real female biology. I want to answer for you Matt Walsh's question, what is a woman? And there's a whole smorgasbord of we could be here all day with all the stuff that's in here and all the information that we now have. I'm just going to give you a few crumbs, a few morsels. So we think of a woman's cycle as, of course, menstruation. But it is so much more than that. Menstruation is just one element, the most obvious. But actually, a woman is cycling in other ways, in so many other ways as she goes through the month, except that it's under the surface. And the hormone that's responsible for all this, all these fluctuations, is estrogen. And estrogen has a global effect on the female body. Here is a graph of how estrogen varies throughout the month. So you'll see that it starts off low, which is during menses, and then it peaks up really high, and that's actually the time of fertility. And this graph is from a lecture that I've given about mikveh. Mikveh is the Jewish ritual bath that a woman will immerse in before she's permitted to resume marital relations with her husband. But anyway, this is what estrogen does throughout the month. Now, estrogen causes subtle changes in a woman's behavior, appearance, her scent, and even the way she moves. And you know what? Men can detect those changes. This is the womanhood that a surgeon cannot give you. So let's start. I'll just go through it quickly. This is a study about facial attractiveness. Women's faces are perceived as more attractive during the days that they're fertile. Men were shown photographs of women that were in their fertile and infertile times of their period. And they were, for example, this one. and they were asked to rate them in terms of how attractive they looked. Now, I don't really see any difference, and I always forget which one it is. I think, oh, I should ask the men.
No, we're not answering.
I think it's the one on the right is the fertile one. In any case, obviously these women were not told anything about what this study was really about. They were just told to, to keep a diary of their cycles and just to come in for photographs and to not wear any makeup and not really have any particular facial expression. So the men were able, in a significant manner, in terms of the numbers here, to identify the fertile period of women. Next. Oh, I wrote it down for myself. It's the left. The left is fertile. Yeah.
I knew you were
You
wrong.
could tell. Okay, I always have to write it down. Okay, next. Next is that during their cycle, women dress more attractively. There were photos that were taken during the fertile and infertile times, and the women wore these masks to obscure their face, and the judges were only able to see their hairstyle, jewelry, and clothing from head to toe, and they were asked, in which photo is the person trying to look more attractive? The judges in this particular study were both men and women, and they guessed, the majority guessed correctly. For example, 2 of the women dressed similarly in each session, but they wore tops with like more a lacy trim when they were at their fertility time. 3 women wear skirts instead of pants during that time. 1 woman added a fringy neck scarf, and several showed more skin. Again, they were not aware of the purpose of the study. Scent. The judges here were men, and they were given T-shirts to smell, T-shirts that had been worn by women in these different times of the cycle, and they were asked to rate which odor was sexier, more pleasant, more attractive. And again, the results were significant. Next had to do with voice. The young women were told to say, "Hi, I'm a student at UCLA." And then it was rated for attractiveness. And again, the results were consistent. Movements. Men judged the attractiveness of how women danced. They used just a silhouette of women dancing and walking. Now this next one, my favorite. You're going to love this. This is a study of professional lap dancers, women who work in gentlemen's clubs. Do they call them that still? Gentlemen's clubs. And they perform these dances on the gentlemen's laps and get tips. So, these very clever researchers took a number of these women, and these were biological women, and they had them chart their periods along with their tips. Now this is, what is this first one? What does it say there?
Since menstruation.
Effects of, oh, okay, so, yeah, okay, that's their tips. Now, let me put over that, this was estrogen, Okay, this is their estrogen and their TIPS. You're seeing it at the same time. Okay, so during their periods, they earned, 1 minute, 185 per shift. During their fertility, during their infertile, during their infertile time, they earned 260 per shift, and during their fertile days, they got 335. So their TIPS went way up when their estrogen was way up. Now, look at what they did. Then they looked at the women who were on the pill. And what the pill does is that it prevents the surge of estrogen. So what happened? Okay, they didn't get to that, they didn't reach that high earning level. Their estrogen stayed low, and so did their TIPS. This is a woman. So I'm going to quote a famous neuropsychiatrist, Luann Brizendine, who wrote the book, The Female Brain and the Male Brain, some time ago. And she said, the female brain is so deeply affected by hormones that their influence can be said to create a woman's reality. Okay, so my unfortunate patients believe such a horrific lie that they can achieve anything close to being a real woman. They believe that, that female is just randomly assigned at birth, and that the gender binary is false and oppressive, and there's no objective reality. These are terrible, terrible things that we're doing to them. And they are paying, and their families, and all of society, paying such a staggering price. It is not possible to become the opposite sex. A woman cannot be constructed in an operating room. I don't care how talented the surgeon is. I don't care how convincing the final product is. The only possibility for my patients and for so many other confused young people is to become a synthetic persona of a woman or a man, created and sustained by big pharma and the techno-medical complex. We have abandoned these children and their families. We are failing them. We are siphoning the meaning of these words, the important words like man, woman. We are living at a time when biological truth is being erased. It's just a blitz of lies. Now, all these things, I'm sure they're upsetting to you as well. I find it deeply upsetting. And I recently read something that I'm going to tell you. I'm going to finish up. But I read something from Rabbi Yisachar Frand. He explained that falsehood actually has a deep effect on our souls, because truth is a building block of the soul. The soul comes from God. So falsehood harms the soul. It's like a poison. Lying, cheating, and deceiving are antithetical to the soul. We used to be able to trust our institutions, our educational institutions, medical, news, media, but we're living at a time when there's a bankruptcy of truth. I want you to honor that gut feeling that you all get, I know you do, when you hear huge falsehoods coming out from places that we once respected and trusted. Please trust that gut feeling that is coming from your soul, that is identifying this information as being false and dangerous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Grossman. I think I can speak for all of us married men that have been married quite some time, and if we took that test, the answer would be, dear, you look beautiful every day of the month. So now I'll bring up Dr. Pat Fagan. Dr. Fagan is the founder and director of Marriage and Religious Research Institute at the Catholic University of America. Dr. Fagan has authored over 30 synthesis papers and has commissioned dozens of original research projects in marriage, family, child development, and religious practice. A native of Ireland, Dr. Fagan received his Bachelor of Social Science in Sociology and Social Administration and a professional graduate degree in psychology, as well as a Ph.D. from the University College Dublin. He has been a grade school teacher, a clinical therapist specializing in child, family, and marital therapy. Welcome, Dr. Fagan.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I feel like a pygmy among giants after that. I really mean it. When I saw who was coming, I said, well, I'm darn lucky to get invited. So I hope I don't disappoint you. You can sum up the social sciences the way I say it is. The social sciences, well done, I mean methodologically, robustly done, cannot but illustrate the way God made men. And on every outcome they do. Some of these I'll go through very fast. We have had enemies of the family. You start with the French Revolution when things began to get serious. Then you had Marx and Engels, very serious. And the more threatening of both of those actually is Engels, because he's the one who really targeted both family and religion. Lenin then put it into practice, immediately taking over Moscow and areas around that. They eliminated marriage. They had to reinstate marriage by the early 30s. The chaos that resulted, just the common sense they reinstated. And then Columbia University is essentially the gateway for Marx, Marcuse, and Millett, the three M's, Kate Millett, and the feminist movement, and all the rest came out of there. One of the significant things that happened in the 60s was men were targeted, and they've been very successful at cowing us men. Most men today are afraid to speak out on matters of their standing within their firms, within their communities, within everything. Our courage has been gutted. And therein, actually, is where I'm going to be heading. But before we go there, we have one of the things to come out of the feminist movement were women's study centers. So this is an undergraduate one. This is the faculty of the undergraduate one at Duke University a couple of years ago. This is the Stanford graduate. There are over 700 centers of women's studies in the United States. I would call every one of them centers of feminist toxicity on sexuality issues. We need, as men, to claim our right to 700 plus centers, no, 1,400 to make up for the lost time, where we will show how men really can be great and are great when they follow the laws of nature and of God. Actually, this is one illustration of, I have over 130 of these. This is, we have 8 federal surveys where you can measure both family and religion. And the tall blue one, this is the grade point average of the biggest survey we have in the US, 16,000. And this is the grade point average of high school kids, math and English combined. The tall blue one is the intact married family that worships God weekly. The lower blue one is the intact family that doesn't worship at all. So you can see the impact of religion. The lowest little one in the red at the back is the broken family doesn't worship at all. And the taller red one is the non-intact family, all those other than the intact married, that worship weekly. And you get this pattern again and again and again. The differences are there, but always on every single outcome, you look at the family, you look at the adults, you look at the children, you look at the mother, you look at the father, same pattern happens. On every single measure there in the federal data system, those from the intact married family that worship God weekly do best on everything. And those from the poor broken family that doesn't worship at all do worst on everything. And the other two trade places, they go up and down. This to me actually illustrates what I would call, what we all call, the two great loves. Love of God and love of a neighbor. Measured in the awful ways the social sciences do. You know, they're rather spastic. But what we measure there is, it's a proxy measure and a pretty decent one. The love of God is minimally expressed in worshiping Him weekly. He's commanded that, by the way, you know. He asked for that. And not a couple of times a month, not a couple of times a year, weekly. Then keep holy the Sabbath day. Then the other great love your neighbor. Well, your closest neighbor is your spouse and the children that you beget together. And in these two, on everything, we see the illustration of the two great loves. Now, within this, actually, if you look at the intact married family, and if you look at men and women, and you look at the data, men tend to be either the weaker or the strongest in their impact on the family. Men are the ones most inclined to get detached from the family, to wander sexually, etc. Or when they are present and really present, they bring a strength to the family that is massive. And in the transmission of faith, we already heard this, the father is the one who has the huge impact in transmitting the worship of God to the next generation, much stronger than mother. And in all sorts of areas, actually, the father either has an awful impact or a very good impact. Now, there's a bell curve behind that, but they're the two big tendencies. And by the way, this is the sort of impact that marriage has. Well, the big one is always intact marriage, and the other are all the different family structures, divorce, remarried, out of wedlock birth, etc., etc. And you can see there's that big jump, and it's pretty universal on every outcome you look at. When you look at the effect of religious worship, what you have there, this is on the grade point average, it's a dose-response effect, essentially. The weekly is the highest, a couple of times a month, a couple of times a year, never. And you see that repeatedly all again. Now, oh, by the way, this is just showing inner city, single mother kids, most likely welfare families. The effect of worship on the education outcome of those kids is that huge black line going up. It's very significant. There's nothing in anything government can do that can come within, as we'd say in the west of Ireland, an ass's roar of that outcome. Actually, this is just a quick thing. The more sexual partners somebody has before marriage, the more likely they are to divorce, and the woman is the one most impacted quickest and most. From 95% dropping down after 2 sexual partners outside of marriage, and mostly before marriage, you get around a 50% divorce rate within 5 years. The biggest problem facing the world is a huge one. It's coming, it's inevitable because of contraception, and it is depopulation. All the developed countries are at about 1.4. All of the Muslim countries are falling very fast, and they are probably going to be the ones who will suffer the most because they tend to be rather poor countries, and the transition is happening fast. So there's huge things coming. That's where probably the whole world will drop below fertility, I think around 2030 or so, 2040. The UN figures are always too optimistic and too late. I think Europe is already deep into depopulation issues. Now, the way you can sum up, this is the way I would sum up from all the data I've looked at over a lifetime, two models of how society thrives. And the green one is the more God, the more marriage, and the more kids. You get a thriving society. Our model today is less marriage, less kids, and less God. And that's a more and more dysfunctional society, and you see that play out in everything. So, the key decision point in raising children is whether they're going to essentially stay chaste till marriage or not. And I want to zero in where I think the future of getting things right lies. And that is in the fathers raising their sons. Now, the mother and he together will be raising their daughters, and the mother will be raising the son as well. But father transmits to son the whole model of being a man. And that model is to belong. To belong, first and foremost, to his spouse. And to belong is to sacrifice. He is there in existence to serve her and her welfare, and together they serve their children. So he's there to give of himself, to give to his children, then to give to his friend, or two or three, and give to his community. The model of the good man, and I think it's the men who are here are all striving this direction, I suspect, is the man who is going to sacrifice. Now, I think we are called, actually, as men, we have to step right up to the plate, into the battle. Solzhenitsyn is one of my great models, and he's a great model in this. He was prepared to suffer as he gradually figured out issues of conscience and integrity. And this is the great gift that God has given to every human being, is a conscience. Starting off, unless it's massively corrupted, people know the difference between right and wrong. But what the good father does is he uses conscience to go much further. Oh, son, you can do it better. You can do good, you can do better, you can do best. And actually the pursuit of the best is actually the pursuit of sanctity, of being close to God. There's no way you can go after the best by yourself. It needs the grace of God. So the father who is needed to step up to combat what you just heard is the father who's going to say to the local school, hands off my children sexually. I'm the sex expert here. I brought this kid into existence through my sexual act. Keep your hands off my kid. And fathers have to, few men will do that alone. A few men together, yes. In the army we know you need a buddy who has your back. Every father needs to find another father who has his back. And then groups of fathers more and more. And there is a fatherhood movement springing up all over the country. You can see more and more fatherhood projects, fatherhood podcasts, all the rest. There's a hunger and there's a readiness. And men, we've got to overcome what the feminists succeeded, is in cowing men. We've got to take back our leadership of our own family. That's all we're asking. This is my family. We are experts on thriving, by the way, as all the data shows. We know what we're about. You don't. You're experts on destruction and wilting and dying. We're experts on thriving and life and passing it on. And this... My time is up. Time goes very quickly. The central thing is marriage. We want to bring our children to marriage, chaste and hopefully virgins. When that happens, the great transition has taken place, And now their phase in life begins where they are going to raise their children to marry well 20, 25, 30 years from now. The man's job is to shepherd that. And our job now is to find other men who are going to help us to do that. That, I think, is absolutely essential for America to save itself. If fathers do not become protectors and protagonists of their own family and their own children's sexuality, kiss all the public policy goodbye. With them, we will get good public policy, and the first big one I think we need is control of our schools. And the way to get that is very simple. You universalize vouchers. And we had a big movement towards that in Virginia in the last election. But the key thing, father there to serve his wife, first and foremost, because on that the children thrive, and his children, and his buddy, and his community, and of course his church. And there's no way he can do that unless he's close to God. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had taken questions in the past. I don't think we're going to take any questions because this panel answered every question that you could possibly have in such a great way. And I just want to point out that the folks up here and some of the people we've seen today are really warriors in the battle to save our families and to save our children. And when you have leaders such as the people up here that we've seen today, they need to have followers. You need to have their back. You need to support them. You need to support organizations like this that are out there speaking the truth and making a difference. So it's great that everyone is here today, and it's especially great. Let's have a round of applause for our warriors up here that are really making a difference. So thank you. And now I'll turn it back over to Jacqueline, and thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. This was an amazing, amazing panel, and yes, there was a lot to absorb and to take in. A couple of points of encouragement. Courage is not dead, and it's contagious. So that you've learned that today, and I hope that you will take that with you. Look around you today. This is Vermont has hope. Look at yourselves. This is encouraging to see you all here, and you are not alone. So